So thank you so much for having me, and thanks, Sam, for setting this up. I'm excited to present a piece. Usually I do a 3-hour workshop, so I'm going to condense. I'll talk fast, but the PowerPoint, there's a lot of words on the PowerPoint. The PowerPoint I sent to Sam, so anyone who's interested in the PowerPoint, Sam will be happy, or I can send it to you. I call this Beyond Diversity 101, Micro Inequities, Implicit Bias, and Moving Toward Equity. So I will just share that I have done quite a bit of work at 2 different institutions. I worked at Metro State University for 11 years as the first ever GLBT, gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender student services director. Went over and did the same kind of work at the University of Minnesota. And then the last thing I did when I was there was I was their first ever director of education in the Office for Equity and Diversity. So I'm sure you know the University of Minnesota is a small city over there. It's got 5 coordinate campuses, and I was tasked with developing an education program around diversity, equity, and inclusion for all students, staff, and faculty, which we did. We developed something called the certificate program that's still going strong. But I started to let alums in, and the alumni would come back and say, can you take this to my work? Can you take this over here? So 2 years ago, I jumped ship and went out on my own and started my own company, Strategic Diversity Initiatives. So let me start with how I approach this work. Not everyone approaches equity and diversity the same way, and again, I'm aware that there's a lot of words and it might be hard to see, but I'm going to share, again, you'll get a copy of this, but I'll share the most important one. So I say that this work is fundamentally about being in community with each other. It's relational work. I mean, we need to have that academic piece of, intellectual piece of like understanding certain things, but at the end of the day, it's about how we relate to each other. So I think it's about building community, creating community, which involves building trust through careful listening, respectful disagreement, and taking risks. So I always say, you don't have to agree with everything I say, or anything I say for that matter. We can be in respectful disagreement. We are not seeing that model in our political and social life right now at all, right? We aren't, and it's sad. But you don't have to agree with everything. But I also believe fundamentally at my core, I'm an educator, and I believe that your education, my education, is in direct proportion to the amount of intellectual and emotional risk we take. So what do I mean by intellectual risk? Well, entertain an idea that seems counterintuitive. Not right, not what I was brought up to believe, or not something, you know, in a little bit we're going to be talking about all the folks out there who are identifying as non-binary, as neither male nor female. A lot of folks, particularly older folks, like myself, I mean, I'm 56, it's a little counterintuitive to think that one can change their gender day to day, and yet this is what's happening more and more. And so entertaining something that just doesn't make sense to you is part of the work of diversity and inclusion. But it's also emotional work, and it's also about taking emotional risks. We're going to talk about race and racism, sexism, misogyny, homophobia, transphobia, ableism, classism, xenophobia. These things don't just exist above the neck. They're not intellectual exercises. They profoundly affect our lived experience, our embodied experience, our souls for that matter, our spirituality, right? And they're profoundly emotional issues. Both when we talk about marginalized identities, right? What it's like living as a person of color, someone who's native, someone who's LGBT or queer. I identify as lesbian. I also use the word queer. Not everyone does, but I reclaimed it, right? So both our marginalized identities makes us vulnerable, but actually the more we start to talk about privilege, what it's like to be white, I identify as white, what it's like to be male, to be heterosexual, to be cisgender or not transgender. These when we talk about privilege, that's also an emotional thing. It often brings up issues of guilt and shame. And so we have to be prepared for that emotional work as well. I do think we're all doing the best we can. This is lifelong work. The person who says, well, this will be my year of diversity. Okay? Can't be your year of diversity. It's okay to make mistakes. That means you're doing the work. I always say it's about social identities and personal values. What do I mean by that? Well, it is about our social identities. So I want to talk about how our marginalized identities tend to stick to us in ways our privileged identities don't. What do I mean by that? Well, I'll share an example. I have 3 children. I have a grown son and a grown daughter. My son is 27, almost 28. My daughter's 24. And then I was in a long-term relationship with a woman for 25 years. And now I'm able to be legally married to a woman who's 15 years younger, and I have a 4.5-year-old. And I'm still standing, so good for me. We just got puppies, so it's like, I know, thank God for caffeine is all I can say. So when my son, many years ago, was in elementary school, we were going around to one of those fairs where you pick a a school, you go up and you talk to a principal or a teacher. So I walked up to a principal and I said, oh, hi, this is, I'm Ann, this is my partner, Deb. This is our son, Dylan. He has 2 lesbian moms, 2 gay dads. And this principal looked at me and he said, well, our school doesn't have an agenda around sexual orientation. I said, well, let me be clear, I don't have an agenda. I have a child living in a non-traditional family structure and I want to make sure he's well cared for. So, needless to say, we didn't go to that school. But if my twin sister, right, if my twin sister had walked up, who's heterosexual, who at the time had 2 children, no one would have said, here comes the heterosexual with the agenda, right? So homosexuals have an agenda. If I said, oh, I'm glad you didn't go to the other part of the church where there's a gender conference, honestly, how many of you would think they were talking about men? Women have a gender, right? And if I said, who's going to be accused in this room of playing the race card? It won't be people like me who are white. We accuse people of color of playing the race card. So race sticks to people of color. And yet, every single one of us who's white brought race in the room. Every single one of us who's male brought gender in the room. And every single one of you who's not who is heterosexual, who's not a part of the LGBT community, you brought those issues of sexual orientation and gender identity in the room. We just don't talk about it. And I think what really will shift things is when we start to shift that vulnerability. When we start to say that we can talk about race with only white people in the room and talk about racism and how white privilege affects what we do in this church or in this community. That we can talk about sexism and misogyny and how it plays out, even if there aren't women in the room. And so that's the piece about our social identities profoundly impact us. And I believe a room filled with white, heterosexual, Christian, able-bodied, cisgender, middle-class men, that's a room with a lot of privilege, right? Just describe some of our politicians. But anyway, seriously, I believe that room could have a radical social justice agenda. I don't believe it's common, I'll be honest, but I think it's possible because I've met people like that who, despite their privilege, right, say, I don't want this legacy. I want to be about inclusion. I want to be about equity. And finally, there's no silver bullet. I had a white female faculty member at the U of M say, could you just tell me, I just came to this training because I want you to tell me how to make my students of color successful. As if there was a list, right? Oh, here, let me pull this out. I'd be a millionaire if there was, right? 400 years of racism isn't going to be, I say, a room full of, good, kind, loving, caring people. I just described all of you here, right? If that would have ended racism, we'd have ended it. It's entrenched. It's what we're built upon, just like misogyny and sexism and homophobia. So this is long-term work, and we have to be prepared for it. I won't get into it now, but I have another workshop I do focus on emotional intelligence and the connection between that and leading around equity and diversity, because this work gets to us. It gets hard. It gets challenging. So what are we going to do? I'm going to talk at you a little bit more. You can tell I'm good at that. I won't say you like it, but I'll say I'm good at it. But I want to tease apart the difference between diversity and equity. Those are 2 different things. And I want to talk a little bit about how things are changing and the pushback that's coming from this changing landscape. Then I'm going to talk about 2 ways. Sam mentioned implicit bias. I'm going to talk about that. I'm also going to talk about microaggressions and micro-inequities. These are 2 ways that the kind of bias I'm talking about around race, around gender, around social identities plays out in our workplaces, our faith communities, our spaces and places that we inhabit. I'm going to give you an opportunity to think about your own social identities, talk about implicit bias, and then we're going to get to teasing apart the difference between bias and prejudice and oppression, because that undergirds our notion of privilege, because that gets us where we want to be, which is how do I act as an ally. But if we don't have that basis, then we don't act as an ally, I don't think, in the right way. And finally, I'll end with some next steps. You can see what I'm talking about. Okay. So, the value of diversity, I'll just tell you a funny story. So, I usually tell this kind of cheesy jokes. All my jokes are cheesy. And I say, who can, tell what's the #1 rule of PowerPoint that I'm breaking? Too many words, right? And I always say, well, I'm a philosopher. We love words. That's our method. So I can live with it. So I made this joke in front of all the staff at the American Library Association in Chicago, and then I read the evaluations. They were not amused. These librarians were like, that was not funny. There are too many words on your PowerPoint. They still keep bringing me back, so that's why I like to give you the PowerPoint. But anyway, this is a great article. It kind of says it all in the title. This is the argument for diversity. We'll start there. How diversity makes us smarter, being around people who are different from us, makes us more creative, more diligent, and harder working. It's by Catherine Phibbs from Scientific American in 2014. And what she says is, a lot of us know if you put the pastor and the architect and the social worker and the poet on a working committee, right, a work group, they'll come to a better outcome because they approach maybe a problem differently, right? But what people don't realize is that social science data shows that's true around social identity as well. That decades of research shows that socially diverse groups, that is groups with a diversity of race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, are more innovative than homogeneous groups. So there's a lot of research out about that. And I'm going to read my last bullet. This is not only because people with different backgrounds bring new information. Simply interacting with individuals who are different forces group members to prepare better, to anticipate alternative viewpoints, and to expect that reaching consensus will take effort. So I do recommend this article because she pulls out lots and lots of studies. There's a study that shows that there's a political science professor who studies how juries function. And he has a whole kind of algorithm about what counts as really good jury, asking a lot of questions, asking to look at materials, listening well, that kind of thing. And he found that all white juries don't function as well as multi-race or, multicultural, if you will, kind of juries, mixed race juries. And the same thing around, they had Democrats working just with Democrats on a problem, and Republicans just working with Republicans. And Democrats working with Republicans, I've heard used to happen many years ago. But that's where the better outcomes came, right? When you worked with someone different from you. Because if I think you're just going to agree with everything I say, I get a little lazy. I don't bring my A game. I don't anticipate that I have to, be prepared for a counter argument. And so this is the argument for diversity, which is important, but this is not the same as equity. We can have very diverse spaces without equity. And I really do believe I just described a lot of spaces in the United States filled with diversity and not equity. So I'll get to the equity in a minute, but I have 3 slides that talk about how things are changing. And the first one talks about people with disabilities. It will be hard for anyone to read this, so this is from an article in CNN Business, More people with disabilities are getting jobs. And it says, people with disabilities have always been underemployed. Imagine you know that. The unemployment rate for people with disabilities hovers at 65–70%. Unemployment rate has not significantly shifted since passage of the ADA in 1990. So that's how deep attitudinal bias is toward people with disabilities. So, but Americans with disabilities have posted year-over-year gains in the job market for the past 21 consecutive months. Now, I would love to say this is because people are now committed to being inclusive around people with disabilities, but no. Why is it we have a worker shortage? We have a big worker shortage. I saw the state demographer speak at an event I was at, and she talked about in the next 10 years how many workers we will not have in the state of Minnesota. You just take in the whole demonization of immigrants and migrants. I was just talking to my neighbor who teaches English as a second language, and she was over looking at the puppies, and she was talking, and she said, yeah, I have friends who are losing jobs because we're not bringing in people anymore, we're not bringing in refugees and immigrants anymore. And so we're not having as many people who we need to teach English to. This is a big problem. So one of the things that's happening is employers are looking to pools of employees they've never tapped before, including people with disabilities. And that means that this is a change. We're going to have people living with disabilities more likely in our workplace, including people with mental health conditions or mental illness, which if you do know anything about that, the National Alliance for Mental Illness approximates that 20%, 1 in 5 Americans lives with a mental health condition. And more people are just saying, I don't want to hide that anymore. I want to be open about the fact that I live with bipolar disorder. I want to be open about the fact I actually have obsessive compulsive disorder, OCD. It's interesting, it's much easier for me to come out as a lesbian than to say OCD. It's like, isn't that interesting? But, we'll find a typo in here for that reason. Anyway, I've never made that joke. But anyway, there's a whole thing called #CureStigma, where just people are coming out more. So that's one way things are changing. Let's talk about gender. You may know that the entire West Coast, Washington, Oregon, and California, now allow you to choose something other than male and female for your birth certificate. And New York City and New Jersey just passed similar legislation. I hope you know that here in Minnesota, we became the latest state to allow you to put something other than male and female on your driver's license. And in fact, Maine, Oregon, California, Washington, and the District of Columbia now allow that. So I have friends who are very excited that they are able to identify in a way that feels more true to who they are. And millennials now make up over 1/3 of the U.S. workforce, according to Pew. The Gay and Lesbian Alliance Against Defamation, which is a big national media organization, estimates as many as 12% of millennials may identify as transgender or non-binary. So by non-binary, not male or female. So I'm training at this wonderful place called Inner City Tennis. It's a great over in not too far away, over near the MLK Park. And I talked about it. I said, have you thought about what will happen when someone comes, because they have men's teams and women's teams, boys and girls teams. I said, what will happen when someone comes and says they identify as non-binary and they say, what team should I play on? And this guy looks at me and goes, is that really a thing? I said, yeah, it's really a thing. So I told that joke. This woman came up to me and said, I want to tell you something. She goes, I work in I'll just say it's a suburban school district in the Western Metro that's both well off in terms of money and also quite large. And she said, we let all of our high school students take the ACT free of charge. Here's the only catch. You have to check a box, male or female, to get the results. She goes, now we told them that. You have to check this box to get the results. Do you know what percentage of our high school students did not check the box? 30%. She said, I don't think 30% of our students are non-binary, but they don't believe in that system anymore. And she said, this is when they knew they wouldn't get their results. That's how, and so these are the folks coming into our workplaces, coming into our colleges, right? And this is a shift, and they might use they, them pronouns, or no pronoun at all. Or their pronouns might shift, and their identities might shift. And this is a big change. I sometimes say, look, when someone 30 years ago decided to teach 3rd grade, they probably never thought they needed to understand gender identity. And now I'm training, this woman brings me in Anoka County, and she says, yeah, part of my work is I have a stepdaughter who's transgender. She's 7 years old. Right? That's a whole different landscape to think about helping a child navigate when their gender identity doesn't match at 7, as opposed to 20 or 30 or 40. And finally, what we do know is the racial and ethnic changes that are happening. So by 2045, we will no longer be minority white as a country. We will be what's called minority white, or I like to think of it as majority people of color, right? And here's the interesting part. If we look at children under 18, that happens next year. Next year, we have more children of color in this country than white children. And for ages 18 to 29, the tipping point occurs in 2027. I would like to think that this means that we see this as a positive thing, a wonderful thing. We're changing. We're always changing. And it's wonderful to have people of color in our communities. And that's why we need to care about equity. But the fact is, it's also freaking an awful lot of white people out. Right? Am I right? You know that? Here's some studies about it. Here's something from National Public Radio, Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, Harvard School of Public Health from October of 2017. They interviewed over 3,400 American adults. 902 of them were white. And 55% of the white respondents said they believe discrimination against white people exists in the US today. Now, only 19% could say, I didn't get a job because I'm white. I don't know what else they would say. I was pulled over for driving while white. I was followed around in a store. I mean, I honestly, as a white person, don't know what they would say. But what the 55% to 19% tells me is this is an issue of perception. Right? I might not really be treated differently, but I perceive that we're talking about race a lot more. And I'm scared. And I think they're coming for white people. And I think, right? And we think, oh, maybe that's, no offense to all of us with the gray hair, oh, that's just us older people. But no, it's not. This is from January 2018, Diversity, Division, Discrimination, the State of Young America. The poll of 15 to 24-year-olds found that 43% of young white men say discrimination against whites is as serious a problem as discrimination against other groups. 29% of young white women said that. And almost half of young white men believe what I do every single day, which is work on efforts to increase diversity, will harm white people. Right? So there is pushback. One more study. There was a social scientist out in Seattle, and there was a subway line or kind of tram line that goes out to the suburbs, that are primarily white. So what he did is he took someone who's identifiably Latinx, right? Latino, Latina, Latinx, kind of more generic, gender-neutral way to say it. And he put them on the train to ride with these primarily white people. And then when they got off at their stop, he would ask these white riders some questions about immigration, right? What do you think of immigration? Is it a good thing? And then the next day, he put more people on, more people of color. Can you guess what happened with the ideas about immigration? The more people of color they saw on the train, identifiable, the worse their ideas about immigration. The more they feared it, and the more they saw it negatively. So it just gets at this idea, and you think about Charlottesville, right, with the tiki torches and Jews will not replace us, and this notion of the world's always worked for me, and now it doesn't. And so let's just remind ourselves why things, why actually we don't have a problem, I don't believe, with white discrimination, or we're seeing that around men too, right, Me Too. So I had this lawyer, and he says to me, you know what I do now? He said, when I, because these guys are getting accused, so now when I have my female employees and they want to meet with me, I leave the door open. He said, what do you think of that? I said, well, I think that your female employees don't get the benefit of privacy because of the bad actions of men. That's what I think. I think it's not a good idea. And then a woman of color who's also a partner, so it was great, partner-partner discussion. She said, yeah, I've got men who don't want to go out to dinner with me. They don't want to go on trips with me when we have to go see a client because they're worried about being accused, right? And this is the pushback. This is now, hey, the world used to work. And now all of a sudden we have to think about sexual assault. I'm like, welcome to the world of women, my friends, right? Where we have to think about when we walk to our car, walk to the bus, or all sorts of things like that. So just some reminders of how much work we need to do, not around just diversity and inequities. The Southern Poverty Law Center is currently tracking more than 1,600 extremist groups, and we know that white supremacy and white supremacist organizations are a direct threat. They're a terrorist organization in the U.S. right now. Hate crimes targeting U.S. Muslims rose 15% in 2017, the second year of increases. Experts are predicting a serious shortage of paid caregivers for people with disabilities and the elderly, exacerbated by low wages, high turnover, and challenging working conditions. I sometimes say that I spend my time trying to get people to care about things they don't have to care about. So I don't live with a physical disability. I read this and I go, oh, this is challenging. But I have a very close friend, Linda, who uses a motorized wheelchair and has a personal care attendant or a group of them. We're having lunch, and she says, yeah, this is tough, Ann, this whole shortage. She said, I just had a personal care attendant I found out was stealing from me. I said, oh, that's awful. She goes, well, that's not the worst part. I can't fire her. If I fire her, I can't get out of bed and go to work. That's what that shortage means, right? So that we're doing some work in the Minnesota legislature to change that. 91% of Fortune 500 CEOs are white men. Does anybody know the statistic about height? That over 60% of CEOs are over 6 feet tall, which just tells me that tall people are smarter. I mean, that joke, someone who's 5'2". And the point is not to never have any white men as CEOs. It's just they don't need to be 91%, right? In a recent EEOC survey of over 5,200 newly employed workers, black job seekers were offered significantly less compensation than whites by potential new employers. That's exactly what I'm talking about, the difference between diversity and equity, right? And it's not just race. Of course, they just did a big study of salary in the tech industry around gender. I don't know if you saw this. Over 40% of women that they surveyed found were being paid less than men with identical job descriptions and identical kind of years of experience. And that ranged from 4% less to 45% less. This is, this is not 1965, this is right now. More than 200 high-powered men have been accused of sexual misconduct. 6 months ago, that was 100 that I had, now it's 200. And finally, a leaked Health and Human Service memo shows plans to redefine sex under Title IX, basing it on immutable biological traits identifiable by or before birth, and where sex listed on a person's birth certificate as originally issued shall constitute definitive proof of a person's sex unless rebutted by reliable genetic evidence. What does that even mean? It means my good friend Anne, who's 8 years older than me, who grew up in the 50s, She was identified male at birth, never felt like a boy, never felt like a man, and she is a transgender woman. And she's an activist, and she's amazing. And she wakes up to find out her federal government is saying, oh no, you're not a woman, because we're going to go with the sex listed on your birth certificate as originally issued, unless unless you can rebut it by reliable genetic evidence, right? So I don't know why we can't have transgender people in the military, why someone like Anne can't say, I'm a trans woman, I'm a good human being. She cared for her mother, died at 99, and I watched her as she cared for her. She couldn't have been a better daughter. I'll tell one quick story. Her mother, I'm not even kidding, was an organist in the same church for 80 years. 80 years in North Minneapolis. When she came out and said, Mom, I'm transgender, her mother said, oh, thank God, I thought it was something serious. I just love that stuff. So let's talk for a few minutes. So we've got these big policy issues, and right, what does it actually look like on the ground in our lives? So now we can talk about microaggressions and microinequities. Why do I use two different words? Well, my cheesy joke is that in Minnesota, I've been here 30 years, so I'm a newcomer, right? So in Minnesota, we like our aggression with a good dose of passivity. So aggression's a heavy word sometimes for Minnesotans. So imagine there's this man, and every day at work, he comments on this young woman's attractiveness. Oh, you look so pretty today. Oh, I love that dress. And a friend pulls him aside and says, Jim, you got to knock that off. That's a microaggression. Jim might go, aggression? I'm being nice to her. I didn't touch. I'm not aggressive. So if that word doesn't work for you, that's fine. Use microinequity. The two things that are important is the micro piece. It's not the worst case of bias, but the inequity piece is also important. I like this website, microaggressions.com. It's not full of statistics or research or studies. It's a place where people can share their own lived experience and how the microaggression made them feel. So what they say is each event, observation, and experience posted is not necessarily particularly striking in and of themselves. I've got about 4 slides where I'll read you some. It's not the worst case of sexism or homophobia or ableism that you'll hear, or racism. Often they're never meant to hurt. Acts done with little conscious awareness of their meanings and effects. But their slow accumulation during a childhood and over a lifetime is in part what defines a marginalized experience. And that can make it hard to explain to someone else. So I sometimes liken it to the fact that trauma and oppression, oppression causes trauma, causes actual hurt. But we can't walk into every space we're in kind of oozing our wound, our hurt. So we cover it up, right? We cover it up with a bandage. And that microinequity, that microaggression is when I remind you about what you walked in with. So I'm training in Chicago, and this lawyer walks up to me and he goes, yeah, he said, I'm Latino, and I go golfing with my buddy. He's white. Every time we go golfing, it gets super competitive, and the more competitive he gets, the more he teases me. And eventually he starts teasing me about being Latino. And using my image, he goes, he doesn't just take off the bandage, he puts his finger in my wound. And I finally said to him, hey dude, you gotta knock that off. And he said, why? I tease you about all sorts of things. He said, yeah, this is something that goes really deep. This is what I grew up with. These are the messages I got from a very young age, that I wasn't as good because I'm Latino. And his friends stopped doing it. So let me share some, and I'll just read them out loud. Maybe you should consider a completely different career path. My workplace after I requested disability accommodations made me feel like professional success isn't an option if you're disabled. A security guard approaches me at an upscale shopping district. I'm the only black person sitting in the waiting area. I'm waiting for a friend and have been sitting for 2 minutes. The security guard ignores the throng of people around me, comes to me and asks, what is your business here? I'm 31 in Chicago, and it made me feel like I was nothing. There's a whole movement now with social media and people capturing things on video of people talking about living while black and the notion of being kind of constantly policed. So there's a gentleman, decides to do a nice thing. He's black. He picks up his friend's kids to give him a ride. His friend's kids happen to be white. They're in the back seat. So a white woman sees him and thinks a black man driving white children is automatically suspect and follows him. Or the woman in St. Louis who walks into her building, well, she's in her building and her neighbor who's black walks in and she says, who are you? And he says, I'm so-and-so, I live here, please move, I want to get to my apartment. Can you prove you live here, she says. He says, who are you? And well, no, I don't need to do this. He goes past her. goes into his apartment, gets a knock on the door, it's the police.
Yeah.
She's called the police saying he made her feel unsafe. Ironically enough, she got fired the next day from her minority-owned realty job. So, and then my personal favorite from as an academic, the young African-American woman at Yale University, graduate student, doing what all good graduate students do, sleep in public, right? But she, you know, she gets the cops called on her by a white woman, because we have certain expectations of who's allowed to take up space and who keeps us safe. And that stuff, or the woman I heard in a training who said she's just waiting in line for first class at the airport, and a white woman taps her on the shoulder and says, "That's first class." Imagine the humiliation. That wasn't even the worst story I heard that day. So part of being an ally is starting to realize we move through the world really differently when we have privilege. Are you a man or a woman repeatedly everywhere? My boss isn't around the business much. When he does come in, he firmly shakes hands with me and looks into the eye of every male employee. I, a female, am the manager of these male employees, and he asks me to make him a cup of coffee and tells me to smile more. While attending a predominantly white church during Easter Sunday, I noticed that several white families of 4 were instantly ushered into available seats at the front. However, a black man and his son, who had arrived earlier than those aforementioned families, waited a while before they themselves were seated. As a person of color, this made me feel unimportant and invisible. Pretty much any time I leave the house in my wheelchair and go to a public place, people feel entitled to come up and ask me the most intrusive personal questions. On a weekly basis, someone asks me, "What's wrong with you?" People frequently talk over my head to my friends or family like I'm mentally impaired. Many people have told me they can relate to my disability because they were on crutches for several weeks with a sprained ankle or broken leg. I'm 27 years old, and the comments are always the worst in big cities and on public transportation. Makes me feel anxious, frustrated, angry, and sad. But you're so cute. Why do you want to be a boy? A woman at my church, one that supposedly is welcoming to gender and sexual minorities. I felt completely worthless, completely erased. Trans men don't always start out looking masculine. I was standing in the cafeteria of a major academic medical center, wearing shirt tie and the same white coat that all my medical school classmates wear with a stethoscope. An older white lady tapped me on the shoulder and asked me, "Excuse me, do you work here? I'm trying to find the suit." And even once I really turned around, it never occurred to her that I'm a medical student, not a cook. I'm a black male medical student in a major Northeast academic medical center. Former President Obama said that he knows very few African Americans who have not gone into a very fancy event and been shown to the kitchen. And my last slide, coworker. So you were born and raised here, yeah? And you're still Muslim? Where he was trying to explain that Islam has too many rules for an American to follow. It makes me feel sad to have to deal with more determined ignorance of Islam. And anytime I, female identified, see the doctor in my college's health service clinic, "Are you sexually active? Yes. Is there any chance you could be pregnant? No. Are you thinking about taking birth control pills? No. Are you taking them? Do you use condoms? No." You may see where this is going. Is there a reason you can't become pregnant? Not that I'm aware of. Then, you know, being condescending. How do you know there's no chance of pregnancy? Last I checked, my female partner would have a hard time pulling that off. I've had 2 people in 2 different trainings say, "Oh, you just described my last doctor's appointment." Yeah. So what I want to do now is just give you a chance to kind of pair up with another person and just talk for a few minutes about your own social identities, because a big piece of being an ally is trying to notice how we move in the world. So, again, social identities, your race, your class, your sexual orientation, disability, nationality. Given your social identities in the communities in which you have lived, worked, and played, with what communities are you most comfortable? What identities do you know the most about? And are there particular identities and communities with which you are less comfortable and or familiar? It's not a contest, like I win, I'm comfortable in 10 communities. Because no one's comfortable everywhere, but starting to notice it is part of being an ally. And have you ever witnessed or experienced a microaggression or microinequity? So I give you a few minutes to have that conversation with just another person nearby. Me? But I want to move in to talk about another way that shows up implicit bias. Some people call it unconscious. University of Washington calls it unexamined. It's a form of stereotyping that is often unintentional, automatic, and outside of our awareness. So is there explicit bias? Of course there is, right? Far too much of it. But part of the reason this is kind of dangerous is it plays out in our decision making and we don't even know it. often contradicting to our conscious beliefs. There is a Harvard Implicit Association test, and actually the document that you have one piece of paper. On the front side talks about two resources that I really like to reference. The Harvard Implicit Association test, a lot of people know this, you can take it online for free. And also the Kirwan Institute for the Study of Race and Ethnicity out of Ohio State University. They compile all of the research, literally hundreds of studies done every year on implicit bias into one place. And so great resources for you. And on the back side, just to read at a later time, some ideas from me about how we can, throughout our lifetime, continue to challenge how implicit bias impacts us. But I took the Harvard Implicit Association test. You can take it around race, around gender, around religion. I was in a workshop and they randomly selected us and I took it on gender. Now, when I moved here 30 years ago, I came here because I wanted to study with a particular feminist philosopher, so I identify as a feminist. I took the Harvard Implicit Association test, and sure enough, as a woman, I showed and it doesn't matter, but as a person, I showed a pro-male and anti-female bias. Right? So I don't say, oh, I'm not a feminist. I just say I was taught well. And so it's often contradicting to what we really believe. It's also called subtle or implicit. Framing it specifically as unexamined puts the onus for change on the person who harbors or acts on bias, holding them accountable. We know if we just say, oh, everyone has bias, it's tempting not to pay it much mind. Oh, it's not a character flaw, right? But actually, we always have to say, everyone shows it, and it's a big problem. It affects who we hire, who we promote, what services we fund, how we do the work, whether it's a faith community or workplace or wherever. So I want to share this, it's about an 8-minute TED Talk from Kristen Pressler, who's the global head of HR for Roche Diagnostics. It's a, it has a slight corporate focus, but in general, I think it's a very helpful introduction to implicit bias. I don't know if it's possible to turn down the lights while we do this, but apparently it is.
Okay, so let me just get this out.
Is that loud enough?
No bias against women leaders. No one could be more surprised about this than me. I'm a woman leader. And on top, I even work in human resources, which means it's kind of my job to be unbiased. In fact, I passionately encourage women to step into leadership. My poor kids would definitely tell you I never stop talking about it. But in spite of my strong belief that women make great leaders, I realized I don't always act like it. Not long ago, within the same week, 2 members of my team asked me to take a look at their compensation. My first reaction to the man's request was something like, yeah, I'll look into it. My first reaction to the woman's request was something like, I'm pretty sure you're good. Day or so later, I'm sitting at my desk, hard at work, and I somehow connected what, up until then, I'd seen as 2 separate events. I'd had 2 very different reactions to basically the same request, and I thought, what's up with that? Might I be biased and not even know it? But I know what you're thinking. This is 2016. It's not a topic. Women leaders are everywhere. Maybe you, like me, have personally hired or promoted lots of women leaders. But then I thought, with all this talk of unconscious bias, might something be going on that I'm not even aware of, if it's unconscious and all? For those of you who might not already have been inundated with this in the corporate world, it's a simple concept, and it's backed up by neuroscience. Our brain has to handle way too much information. So in order to manage it all, our brain takes the liberty of looking for patterns and filtering for us what it sees as the most important bits, like autopilot. Our brains take shortcuts. Without these shortcuts, we'd have to sit and really think through way too much information. Imagine if every single time you had to think through everything from how to open doors to how to shake hands to how to sing happy birthday. But brain shortcuts do have a downside, because they see patterns that are based on the cumulative effect of everything you've been exposed to throughout your life. Which means the whole thing is happening also in the back of our minds, which means we're not even aware that it's happening. This can cause us to behave in ways that are not true to who we want to be or how we feel we are, and we might not even know it. Unconscious bias sounds kind of clinical, but I looked it up, and other words for unconscious are comatose, paralyzed, or senseless. And other words for bias are bigotry, intolerance, and unfairness. Okay, so that would mean we're not just unconsciously biased, we're actually senseless, intolerant bigots. So that's not something I want to be, consciously or unconsciously. And here's the scary part. Most of us think we can outsmart it. We believe it when we say things like, I don't see race, or I just hired the best person. It just so happened that at the time of the 2 pay requests, I was doing research on unconscious bias. And the research said, these are our expectations of men. We expect them to be assertive and strong and driven. And these are our expectations of women. We expect women to be helpful and sensitive and supportive. If we were to make it a little bit tighter, we see men as taking charge and women as taking care. No, it's not because every single one of us is a misogynist. It's simply because men taking charge and women taking care is what we've mostly been exposed to throughout our lives. And our brains will do the rest, unconsciously redirecting us into those patterns that it recognizes. Still feeling like this bias couldn't possibly belong to me, one of the words jumped out at me. Wait a minute. Do I see the man as a provider, and so I looked at his pay request more seriously? And do I not see the woman as a provider, and so I've somehow dismissed her request? In that moment, I had to realize I do. I see men as providers, but not women, which is really interesting because I'm the sole financial provider for my family of 6. My husband is a stay-at-home father for our 4 children. I take charge, and he takes care. I'm the last person I could imagine who could ever have a bias against women leaders, and yet I had to realize I have a bias against women leaders. I have a bias against myself. And if you're thinking, wow, bad on her. Unfortunately, I'm not the only one with this bias. The research shows that we all have a bias against women leaders. We just don't know it. I had both a man and a woman ask me for a raise at the same time, so I was confronted with my different reactions real time. And I could notice it when I was accidentally treating people differently. Luckily that happened and I realized in time, but how many times have I not caught myself? How many times have you not caught yourself? So what's the antidote to being a senseless, intolerant bigot toward women leaders or anyone else? It's a big stretch to imagine that we'll always have the opportunity to cross-check our reactions with 2 different people in real life. But I've realized we don't need to. We can do this comparison mentally, and it's just as eye-opening. Just mentally flip whoever you're dealing with for someone else to test yourself. Like here. I made a slight change to this slide. I flipped the photos. Does anything on this slide feel weird? Flip it to test it. If it feels weird, you might want to check yourself. The more I tried it, the more I saw the value. In fact, there's this Twitter account that just flips the gender of things we commonly say, and suddenly they become funny. Being called a policewoman doesn't bother me at all, because I know it covers both women and men. Andrew, policewoman, age 40. Or, let's take my hometown baseball team, the Cleveland Indians. Flip it to test it. How would you feel to be up in the stands cheering for the Cleveland Caucasians? Now, maybe you're thinking, this doesn't happen to me. And maybe you're right. Maybe you are a superhuman person who manages to intersect those brain shortcuts at exactly the right moment to ensure you're behaving bias-free and consistently with your values and beliefs in all of your actions. It could very well be. But what have you got to lose to double check yourself? If we all started to flip it to test it, we might just be surprised at how often we would choose to behave differently. Because what if you're missing an opportunity to see the world differently? Thank you.
So I want to show a few slides and then one more quick video and then take some questions. So packing it in. There are the resources I mentioned. 4 slides to just show you what this research looks like, because there's a lot of it. What the research might look like is, in this case, are Emily and Greg more employable than Lakeisha and Jamal? We take absolutely identical resumes. Only thing different is the name. And in a US context, Emily and Greg are more stereotypically associated with white people. Lakeisha and Jamal more stereotypically associated with African Americans. And look at this. The Emily and Greg resumes had 50% more callbacks. And we see this over and over again. Many other studies, including those dealing with housing, healthcare, online sales, perceptions of risk and safety, have demonstrated that people of all racial identities demonstrate a pro-white and anti-black bias. Some people think implicit bias is a bias towards your own group. It's a bias toward the group with social, political, and economic power. That's why women show a bias toward men, even though they're women. That's why, even though there's less implicit bias around race with people of color, still, they are more likely to show a pro-white and an anti-black bias. And we see this with things like, they did a study of doctors. When African-American patients present and white patients with identical levels of pain, doctors routinely under-medicate African-American patients. They move them forward for orthopedic surgeries, cardiac surgeries, less likely, even if you're presenting with identical kinds of symptoms. So we see this over and over again. And we see it with gender. Here's a study where they took science faculty, right? People you would think are smart, objective. They sent them a lab manager position. Only difference is the name, male or female. And look at this. Both male and female professors rated male applicants more competent, more hireable, more suitable for mentoring, and offered males higher salaries. Absolutely identical resumes, right? So as with race-focused research, people of all gender identities demonstrate a pro-male and anti-female bias. Pride and Prejudice, this one is looking at sexual orientation. There's fewer studies, but now we can have the same name on the resume. We just have one resume that references a gay campus organization and one a more generic campus organization. This particular one was also looking at areas of the country, but applicants who listed a gay campus organization versus a more generic one had 40% fewer callbacks. And then finally, disability. I wanted something about that. So attitudes towards individuals with disabilities. It's there were a literature review. They looked at 17 articles and found a consistent pattern of moderate to strong negative implicit attitudes toward individuals with disabilities. And this is even true, little to no association between explicit and implicit. Again, meaning you might have a disability yourself. You might have someone in your family with a disability. You're still going to show a bias against people with disabilities. This is because it's those shortcuts. It's what we've been taught. It's the stereotypes. So what do we do to counter it? We want to act as an ally. Some people call it a champion, a co-conspirator. It doesn't matter what the word is. Whatever it is, it's a placeholder that says whatever your lived experience and your social identity, you can be on the side of inclusion. So I believe an ally is someone who's willing to pay attention to and take action around the social, economic, and political differences and inequities that attend to people. Now, I have more words. I don't have time for it. But
you haven't said anything about age.
Yes, I haven't, and I should have. So thank you for pointing that out. It's always like that. And age is one of those interesting things where the way age stereotypes play out tends to be around that there is this sweet spot, right? So if you're either too old or too young. Because I've had a lot of people talk to me about ageism in the workplace in terms of getting older. I was just doing a focus group, and I had a woman, no, this was a workshop actually in Rice County, and she said, she had beautiful gray hair, and she said, because of my hair, people say things to me like, can you use a computer? And do you have a flip phone? And she's like, no, I don't have a flip phone, and yes, I can use a computer, and why do you assume that because I'm older? On the other side, we see sometimes kind of this anti-young people, anti-millennial thing happening. So I had someone say to me, could we stop using the word millennial like it's a dirty word? I mean, I'm a millennial, it doesn't mean there's anything wrong with me. But somehow there's some sweet spot where, what, if you're 35, you're perfect? You know, you're not too old and you're not too young. But the fact is, and then, so thank you for pointing that out. Age is absolutely one of those places. I should probably look and see if there's some implicit bias. I wouldn't be a bit surprised if there was implicit bias around age. Go ahead, yeah.
One of the subtle things about implicit bias, I learned this in connection with people with physical handicaps, is that the way a lot of us were trained were to help them.
Yes.
But it was helped by doing things for them,
Right.
not by enabling them to do things for themselves.
Yes.
And there is an important difference.
Oh, there is. You want to always leave the power with the person. I've heard stories of colleagues who were blind who were like, if I get dragged across the wrong street, you know? and stereotypes around people with accommodations are, you know, the whole notion is that all we, you know, to be a person with a disability means that all we're doing is accommodating them. Very negative. Yeah, back here.
And with age, it is somewhat cultural. You know, in the United States, age is disrespected. In other parts of the world, it's respected.
Yeah, it is cultural. You're absolutely right. That there may be cultures where age is really seen differently in terms of respect for people who are older. That is not the case in kind of our typical social milieu in the United States, I would argue. I mean, we could do, I'm sure there are studies out there about the number of people who are on television who are older, right? And how few those are compared to people, again, in kind of this sweet spot. Yeah.
I just want to request that she finish these slides, and then we can move on to Q&A.
Well, I just want to, if I could, I want to show this one last video, which I think really gets at being an ally. I love Dr. Joy DeGruy. She is a social worker who does a lot of work on the effects of slavery on the African American family. And in this video, though, she's just going to talk about what it's like to be an ally. It's quite short. So, and then I'd love to take questions. Thank you.
Yes.
My sister-in-law, who's half black, half white, but looks white. Blue eyes, whiter than most white folks, very white. She and I, we kind of grew up together. We raised our children together. So they're first cousins, and it's a wonderful, very, very multicultural family. So we're going in a Safeway one day. And Kathleen, my sister-in-law, is in front of me. And she's, writing a check for her groceries. Now, my daughter, who at the time was 10 years old, was standing with me, and I was directly behind her, getting ready to get my groceries. So Kathleen comes up, and the checker, who is a strawberry blonde, freckled, very delightful, warm, the checker, this young woman, is talking to Kathleen. Hey, how you doing? Isn't it a nice day today? They're just chatting up, and says, yes. So Kathy writes her check, and she steps off to the side with her groceries, because she's waiting for me. Of course, again, Kathleen looks white, right? So I come up. No conversation. She looks up at me. Absolutely no, just a little chatter. And I write my check. My daughter, however, is 10, notices immediately the difference in how she responds to me. So I write my check, and she goes, I'm going to need 2 pieces of ID. At which point, my daughter looks at me, and she gets very, very embarrassed, and tears are kind of coming from her eye, like, Mommy, you're not gonna let her do this. Why is she doing this to us, right? So I'm trying to figure out what I should do, because behind me are 2 elderly white women, right? And I'm thinking, okay, so then I become the angry black woman, right? And they're gonna be, and I'm just trying to second guess all the drama. So then I just give her the 2 pieces of ID. I said, some things you gotta choose your battles, right? And then it gets worse. She pulls out the bad check book. So this is the book that shows the people who have written bad checks. So she starts searching for my license in the bad checks, at which point it's just out of control now. Just as I'm standing there trying to decide what to do, and it's really deeply humiliating. Now my daughter is full-blown emotionally upset, who's 10. My sister-in-law walks back over. And she steps in and she says, excuse me, why are you doing this? And the checker goes, well, what do you mean? She goes, why are you taking her through all of these changes? Why are you doing that? She goes, well, this is our policy. She goes, no, it's not your policy because you didn't do that with me. Oh, well, I know you've been, she goes, no, she's been here for years. I've only lived here for 3 months. And so at this point, the two white elderly ladies go, oh, I can't believe what this checker has done with this woman. It's totally unacceptable. At which point, the manager walks over. So the manager walks over and says, is there a problem here? And then my sister-in-law again responds, she goes, yes, there is a problem here. Here is what happened. So you see, she used her white privilege, and even though Kathleen is half black and half white, she recognizes what that means. And she made the statement. She pointed out the injustice. And she, as a result of that one act, influenced everyone in that space. But what would have happened? I can't know for certain had the black woman said, this is unfair. Why are you doing this to me? Would it have had the same impact? But Kathleen knew that she walked through the world differently than I did. And she used her white privilege to educate and make right a situation that was wrong. That's what you can do every single day.
So, do I have time for one more story? No. Okay. Any questions?
Question about something that Brad said kind of triggered this for me.
Okay.
The ageism thing. And I wanted to ask my occupation. I make jokes about my age all the time, and I talk about, oh, I'm so old, and you know, and I make those sort of jokes.
Yeah.
And I think by doing that, I perpetuate a stereotype about aging. Does that happen in other groups as well that you're familiar with? I mean, is it, so I guess I want to hold myself accountable for being who I really am as an aging person, which is, you know, relatively healthy and active and smart and like, yeah, my memory's not quite what it was, but yeah, but I mean, you know, so I'm just curious about whether you see that in other groups as well. It doesn't really matter, I guess.
You know, I think it's tricky. I was thinking about that. Certainly, I have been making jokes about my memory and stuff because it's really changed. And it impacts you. Like, it's a big deal when your body changes and your memory changes and things like that. I was thinking about, sometimes I'll talk about the LGBTQ community and our words, and I'll make jokes like, we are so creative, like there's always a new word, right? Like, to learn about our community. But at the end of the day, overwhelmingly, for me, I think it comes from a sense of, I mean, I do talk about how old I am, which I think pushes on that notion of shame of like, you know, why is it okay to say you're 25 but not at 65?
Yeah.
You know, when you meet people like that, and I'm like, and I respect anyone, it's an individual choice, but I try to own my age to say, I'm glad, I mean, I had a sister who died at 48, I'm glad I've made it to 56, right? You know, and the same thing with being queer. I love being queer, even if I can sometimes push on my community some of its idiosyncrasies. But the issue is, you know, it's really different when you do it and you're a member. So it's the same thing sometimes around language. Like, people are like, you use the word queer? That's a horrible word. And I'm like, well, I'm reclaiming it. But if someone just says to me, oh, hi, Ann, are you queer? And they don't know me, I might take that the wrong way. Right? The same thing around racial language. So, you know, like, there are words that I will never utter. I don't, you know, they're too hurtful. I don't think a white person should ever say it. I don't care how many friends they have or what you know, they might be quoting. Some words are hurtful. And that's an issue, for example, for the black community around some of their language or other kinds of language. Or my friend Linda, I mentioned, she uses the word crip, right? Yeah, it's internal, and but I would never use it because I don't identify with that community, but she'll use it as, it's a way to, reclaiming language is a way of reclaiming power. So language is very powerful, and anyone who's an ally needs to pay close attention to it, and how people use it. So one quick story, I had this man, he raises his hand, he said, you keep talking about African American and black people. He goes, I'm not African American, I'm black. And he was frustrated. I said, well, thank you for telling me. I will never refer to you as African American. I will refer to you as black. I will follow your lead, number one rule. But let me tell you why I use both. Because I do know people who use both. But I will never use the word Negro because that's outdated, right? So I like to talk about how the goal is not perfection, it's being intentional and deliberate. So you might still get something wrong, but you want, if someone calls you out or calls you in, you want to say, well, here's what I was thinking. Tell me if I'm wrong, but at least I thought about it. What you want to avoid is the like, I don't know, I don't think about this stuff, so I just use whatever's in my head. No, you want to avoid that.
Yeah. Samantha, can we have that?
Yeah.
And I should say, the Mount Olive Foundation supports this work, and so if it's, if this is something that you would like, we can delve into, a different aspect of some of the topics that Dr. Phibbs covered, and we'd be delighted to arrange that.
Yeah, I love it. Thank you.